It is my honor to introduce our guest speaker, Dr. James Stoner, Jr. Dr. Stoner is a professor of political science and director of the Eric Voegelin Institute at Louisiana State University. Since 1988, he has taught courses in political theory, American constitutionalism, and the Western tradition. Dr. Stoner is the author of 2 books and co-editor of 5 more. He earned his PhD at Harvard University and his AB at Middlebury College. We are grateful that Dr. Stoner serves as the Harveston Board on the Harveston Board of Directors. Please join me in welcoming Dr. James Stoner, Jr.
Well, thank you very much, Dr. Clarkson, Dr. Thomas, and all the others for welcoming me. Thank you all for coming and for that wonderful presentation. I knew 2 of those readings, but I didn't know the poem. It was by Ralph Emerson, is that right? And it was written after the war, is that right? Okay, very good. I didn't know that one. I knew he's the one who wrote the one about the revolution too, right? By the rude bridge that, that's Emerson, by the rude bridge that arched the flood. Do you know that one? Have you memorized that one yet? That's next year, no, this year, because that's about the Battle of Concord, which was in 1775, so that has its 250th anniversary here. When I went to graduate school in Massachusetts, I went out and saw Emerson's home, and they explained to me, this was a few years after the bicentennial, the 200th anniversary of the Revolution, a lot of celebrations at that time, and when I went out there, they referred to the bicentennial as having happened 2 years before. And I thought, well, that's funny. I thought the bicentennial was in 1976, and this was 1977. They explained, oh no, Massachusetts, the revolution was in 1775. It was over by March of 76 when the British pulled out and went to New York. So they have a different view of things up there. But that, so Emerson is right on time today. Well, I want to talk today, in the few minutes I have, about the relationship between the Declaration of Independence and the Constitution. In those copies of the Constitution that you have, the pocket constitutions, you'll see both the Declaration and the Constitution are there for you to read. And the Declaration was written in 1776, as you know. The Constitution drafted in 1787, and it goes into effect in 1789 after being ratified. But Declaration and the Constitution, we put them together, or they often put them together in a little pamphlet or book, but their spirits seem in some way really different. The Declaration proclaimed a revolution. The Constitution was an act of reform. And revolution and reform are often seem to be really different alternatives. They're both about change, but one is about change that involves a fight and even violence, and the other about peaceful change ordinarily. The Declaration is seen as a radical document, separating the Americans from English government, but even more than that, establishing a different understanding of what government is than what the British held, and what most Europeans held at the time. Whereas the Constitution sets up a government meant to be as strong as the governments of Europe, and meant to be able to be their equal, and in fact, looking a bit like them. The Revolution overthrows a king, and the American Constitution sets up a president with powers that are relatively similar to those of a king, especially in the hands of certain presidents. So, but what I want to say today is there is a real connection with these, even though the one is about tearing down the past and the other about building up the future. And that's in my title. I want to say that the Constitution keeps the promise made by the Declaration. And I want to show you that by looking at the document. Now, if you turn to page 10, I think, you'll see the beginning of the Declaration. You didn't read that, right? You read the preamble to the Constitution. But the beginning of the Declaration, those first 2 pages, have you read that before, by the way? Have you looked at this in class or studied it in class? They will soon. Okay. Okay. So here's a preview. The Declaration is really broken into 3 parts. The first part is here on pages 10 and 11. And these are the 2 very famous first paragraphs. They lay out the theory of government that the Declaration proclaims and which the founders endorse or borrow in order to justify their actions. This theory says that government doesn't come from above. I mean, it acts like it's above you, right? But government doesn't come from above. It doesn't come from God or from the wisest man or from the strongest man or anything of that sort. It's true that the beginnings of government do come from God according to the Declaration, but God gives us rights in our natures by virtue of creating us as human beings. And then human beings make government in order to secure those rights. So it's a different theory of government. Instead of government coming directly from God and then people have to obey it because God said so or because whoever was in government said that God said so. The argument is that God made us and we can understand. He made us with minds so we can understand something about who we are. And part of what we understand are, well, these self-evident truths, right? And these truths are, first of all, that all human beings are created equal. They say all men, but the term man here is meant generically to refer to all human beings. So all men are created equal. And how are we equal? Well, we're not all the same height. We're not all the same age, obviously, right? But we're equal in the sense of having the same rights. You know what those are? You ever hear this phrase? Rights to life, liberty, and do you know the third? Well, you will next week or a couple weeks from. Yes? The pursuit of happiness, exactly. We have a right to life, to liberty, and to pursue happiness, to seek happiness for ourselves. And governments are there not to suppress those rights, not to take our lives or confine our liberty or destroy our prospects of happiness, but quite the reverse. Governments are there to secure our rights. We're the ones who have to make what we will of our lives and to find happiness if we can and to learn how to do that. But it's not that government's going to tell us that or make us happy. Government is not going to make you happy. You probably know that already, right? And it's complex to see how government makes you free, but that's what they're seeking. And the flip side of that is this: if God gives us rights, so we start with these rights, and then human beings make government to protect those rights, then if a government doesn't protect those rights, then what happens? Well, that's the third, really, of the self-evident truths, that if government becomes destructive of its end, if it violates rights instead of protecting rights, then people have a right to alter or abolish it. That's the phrase. To change it, to throw it off, and to establish a new government. It's not that we can do without government. Might be nice if we could. But you see, people have a tendency to violate one another's rights, sometimes accidentally, sometimes intentionally. They take for themselves and don't think about the others around them. You've had some experience with this, maybe? Yes, of course you have. Everybody has. So you can't do without government, but you can make a choice. Say the American founders. You can make a choice about what government could be. Now, what they have to prove to justify their revolution is that the British have been violating their rights, that the British government has become, well, he says, that turned themselves into a despotic government. You ever heard that word, despotism, or heard someone referred to as a despot? Maybe you know the word tyrant or the word tyranny. Despot is a word that comes from the Greek language. And a despotes in Greek, you study classical languages, you know some of this, right? So despotes in Greek, does anyone know what that is? You haven't done Greek, you've done Latin, is it? Well, yes, but it's more specific. A despotes is a master in the sense of a master of slaves. So the argument is that if a government acts like a despot, that means it's treating people like it's slaves. And the authors of the Declaration and the Constitution, at least some of them, knew what that was because some of them owned slaves. You know this. So they didn't want that for themselves. That's for sure. And so they felt they had to change the government, but they had to prove that the government was being despotic. How do they prove that? Well, that's the long middle section of the Declaration. So if you go back to your book again, you see, or your little booklet, you'll see on page 11 towards the bottom, there begins a long list of things. They call them facts submitted to a candid world. Do you see that's the last sentence of the long paragraph there on page 11? To prove this, to prove that the government's become despotic, let these facts be submitted to a candid world, they say. And then they list things that the king has done. He has refused his assent to laws most wholesome and necessary for the public good. He's forbidden governors to pass laws of immediate and pressing importance unless suspended in their operation until his assent should be obtained, and so on and so forth, right? The long list. He has. If you turn the page, on page 13, there are more of these charges. He has done this, he has done that. And then they say, towards about two-thirds of the way down the page, see if you see this on page 13. He has combined with others to subject us to a jurisdiction foreign to our Constitution and unacknowledged by our laws, giving his assent to their acts of pretended legislation. Now, what Constitution are they referring to here? Do you know? This is a stumper. Most scholars don't even pay attention to this. It can't be this one, you see. Why not? The Declaration is written in 1776, and the Constitution isn't written until 1787. So they're not seers. It's not that they had some crystal ball or some magic glass or something where they could see through and speak about a Constitution that wasn't there yet. They're referring, yes? It would be the English or the British Constitution, yes, or the British Constitution of North America. Very good. And where is that written? Anybody print that up, or you ever seen a copy of that? See, no one's seen a copy of that because it's unwritten. The British have an unwritten constitution. And so part of what's new about our Constitution is that it's in writing. Actually, by the time they write the Constitution of the United States in Philadelphia, there have been a number of other written constitutions that have been developed, but they were developed by the individual states. 11 of the states wrote constitutions between 1776 and I think it's 1784. So a decade before, roughly, the U.S. Constitution was written. So they came with a lot of practice in writing constitutions. But writing constitutions was a new idea. It was a matter of putting in writing something that they were used to having unwritten. Used to having is just so. Now, are there any rules you obey that you don't have in writing? You have any rules here? You have a lot of rules here at school, right? Can we talk? Dr. Thomas, if you're still here, just cover your ears now because I want them to speak honestly here. You have rules, right? You have a lot of rules. You have big rule book. You probably have a rule book that is longer than the Constitution of the United States. Is that right? I think so. But you probably also have some rules that aren't written down, right? I mean, things teachers will say, sit up straight, they'll say. Oh, now y'all did it. You say, sit up straight, or don't speak while another's speaking. That's probably not even in the rule book, right? Because it's so fundamental and obvious. If you wait your turn to speak or something like that, I bet that isn't even in the rule book, is it? Because people know that. You know that, right? You know that from having been in school. Yes. What's that? Oh, it's written on the board. It's written on the board. All these rules are written on the board.
No, just the scholarly position.
Oh, okay. How you sit. Okay, so we put a lot of these in writing. So it's often true, though, that rules that are in writing were actually rules first that were just in speaking, or they were practices. Again, they're probably things that, okay. Is it written on the board? You can tell me this. Is it written on the board, don't burp in class? Is that written on the board? Is that a rule in class? Of course, I mean, or at least out loud, or at least not intentionally. Sometimes the body does what the body does, but you don't need to put that in writing to know that's a rule, right? Now you'll say, well, these are the little things. We put the big things in writing, not the little things. This is something of a change that the founders of the Constitution are establishing. Let's put the rules in writing. What's the advantage of having rules in writing? Yes. Everyone can see them. And everyone knows what they are, right? Including the person who's enforcing it. So if the rule says, I don't know, what's the scholarly position? Okay, so if somebody tries to get you to say, well, the rule today is sit in a slouching position, right? I mean, I guess you probably all know how to do that, but that wouldn't be the rule. And someone, because you can't just make up the rule, I suppose, unless it's someone with authority. But you all know what the rule is because it's there in writing. And you know the same rule. The teacher knows the same rule as you, right? It's there in writing. And that's part of the point. The teachers and you all have the same rules. And that's part of what a constitution is aiming to do, right? Except it said the teachers, it's the government. The government and the people are bound by the same rules, and now they're going to be in writing so we know what they are. Well, at least what the basic ones are. The most important ones are, or at least the most important ones are from the point of view of government. But the English didn't have a written constitution. So when the colonists are speaking of this constitution, they're speaking of what they know and they're confident the British know, the rules they know, like not burping in class or whatever it was, that nobody ever bothered to put in writing, but that they could agree on. These are the rules. Or at least that's the colonists' view. These are the rules, and they ought to be obeyed, and the king has disobeyed them. Or the king and parliament, because when it says he's combined with others, they mean with parliament, the members of parliament, who are claiming to be a legislature for the colonies, but from the point of view of the colonists, that's not a legitimate claim. They are the legislature for England and for Great Britain, but not for the colonies. The colonies have their own legislatures. In Massachusetts, they called it the General Court. In Virginia, it was the House of Burgesses, and so on in the different original colonies and states. Now, you'll see there's this whole list, and what I gave you on the handout is the list of different facts submitted to the candid world. They aren't facts in the sense of dates and names, but what they do is reference well-known events at the time that were seen as violations of the English Constitution. And so, if these are the violations, The promise of the Declaration, I suppose, right? Because what they're going to do in that last paragraph, I mentioned that at the end, we therefore declare these to be free and independent states, which have certain powers. They're separating from Great Britain. But there's an implicit promise, isn't there? See if you think this makes sense. There's an implicit promise that when they set up their own government, it's not going to do the things the British did. Does that make sense? I mean, if they throw the British off for becoming despotic, their claim is going to be, when we set up an alternative government that won't be despotic, it isn't going to do these things the British did. And what you can do, and you don't have to fill this in, but I'm going to point to a few of these points, is you can actually find for every single point made in the Declaration in the left-hand column, something in the Constitution itself that responds to it. So let's take that first point, that the king refused his assent to laws. What does that mean when the king refused his assent to laws? Do you know what that was called? Yes. No. No, treason would be making war against the king. Refusing the assent, if the king refuses his assent to laws, that's called exercising his, it's a term from Latin, I think, right? Veto. Veto, or his negative. Because according to the British Constitution, any law that was made by Parliament or any law made by the assemblies in North America, the North American colonies, had to receive the assent of the king before it became a law. And if the king didn't give his assent, it didn't become a law. So in Great Britain, the king could simply veto an act, and that was the end of the act. The kings did that in the early centuries, but interestingly, in the 18th century, the 1700s, the kings didn't exercise the veto. But they did over the Americans. And what would happen is when the Americans passed an act of legislation in their assemblies, they would have to send it across the ocean to the king, or actually his privy council, and wait until that was approved. And that's the delay they're complaining about. So how are they going to solve that so the Constitution doesn't do that? Well, now turn to page 32. That's in the Constitution itself. It's in Article 1, Section 7, and that's the description of how a bill becomes a law. And there you'll see, well, maybe you know this, what happens after both houses of Congress have passed a bill? What happens before it can become a law? Do you know? Does anybody else have to get involved and sign it? The president does, right? Not the king. We don't have a king, but we do have a senior executive officer called the president. And the president has to sign the bill for it to become a law, or else he can veto the bill. But here's the difference. Here's the remedy to the mischief. If a president vetoes a bill, Congress can do what? It can override the veto. So that if to pass a bill, it takes a majority in both houses of Congress, and then it goes to the president. But if the president vetoes the bill, if 2/3 of both houses of Congress repass the bill, it becomes a law whether the president wants it to or not. So you see, a president can't do what a king could and refuse his assent. All he can do is send the bill back, and if Congress really wants it, that is to say, wants it enough that 2/3 of them agree, then it can become a law without his signature. And by the way, he has to do that within 10 days. Well, Sunday's accepted, it says. He has to do it within 10 days, so none of this delay that they were complaining about. And see, if you start going down the list, you'll see that the things they complain of, they find a remedy for. Is this pretty technical and pretty specific? Well, yes, at some level it is. But they're trying to solve the problem, not by saying, we'll throw the bad guys out and our guys will be good guys. That's the oldest idea in politics, and it's also the one that generally proves not to be so, because you throw the rascals out, and guess what? The guys who threw them out soon enough become rascals themselves, or at least they're rascals to 51% of the 49% of the people or whatnot. And that's what they're trying to prevent. They're trying to develop a system that draws on the British Constitution but puts it in writing and improves upon it. That's what they're doing in these details of the Constitution. And that's why the details really matter. And the person who masters the details is the one who's going to, well, he may not get what he wants, or she may not get what she wants out of American politics, but you can be sure that you're not going to get what you want out of American politics if you don't master the details of the Constitution. But on the other hand, anyone who masters them has an equal chance of figuring out how to make the Constitution work for them. So, to take another example, he has made judges dependent on his will. You'll see that in, what would that be? That would be page 12, probably, huh? One of the complaints. Made judge, yes, top page 13, thank you. He's made judges dependent on his will alone for the tenure of their offices. How do they change that? How do they fix that in the Constitution? Well, in Article 3, the article about courts, they make judges independent. They have their office on good behavior. So no one can say, I don't like this judge, and throw him out. Not even the president, especially not the president. This particular president has complained a lot about judges, but the judges still have their job. He can do absolutely nothing to remove a federal judge because they hold their office on good behavior. Now, if they misbehave, there's a process for removing them. They can be removed by impeachment, which requires both houses of Congress, the House of Representatives to bring the charge, the Senate to hold a trial. You know how many justices of the United States have been impeached? Yes.
2.
What are their names? See, I think it's only one. And he was not removed, Samuel Chase. There have been a few other federal judges who've been impeached and even removed. Just a few, and only in the last 40 years, if I'm not mistaken. But you're right, it's very few. It hasn't been used because the judges, I guess, have generally been on good behavior. Whatever that means, that's part of the question. But you see, there's a remedy for that mischief. And this runs through, I'm not going to go through in detail, but you can do it if your teachers want to assign you that worksheet later on in the semester after you've studied the Constitution. I do want to point out, though, something after those lists, or at the end of the list. Back to the Declaration now. Page 14. After that long list of acts that were made with Parliament that are considered unconstitutional acts, there's a return to the lists that say he has, right? You saw how there's a list that says for this, for that, for that. Those are the acts of pretended legislation. And then the accusations against the king. He has done this, he has done that. And now they say he has abdicated government here by declaring us out of his protection and waging war against us. That refers to the fighting that was going on in Massachusetts and elsewhere already when the Declaration was written, mostly Massachusetts. He's plundered our seas, etc. He's transporting large armies of foreign mercenaries. Who were they, the foreign mercenaries? Do you know? Yes. Yes, the Germans are Hessians. Right, exactly. Then it says he's incited domestic insurrections amongst us and endeavored to bring on us the inhabitants of our frontiers and so forth. The domestic insurrections. Do you know what that refers to? Anyone want to try? The British offered freedom to slaves if they would fight with the British. And that's referred to here. The Declaration, in fact, had a clause in Jefferson's draft. Do you know about this? In Jefferson's draft, there was a clause to the Declaration that complained, among the complaints against the king was, he has waged cruel war on human nature by transporting a people who never did him any harm across the ocean to serve others, something to that effect. And that's a condemnation of the slave trade. And Congress removed that, partly, I guess, because the members of some of the southern states wanted to continue the slave trade, partly because the members of the northern states realized that they too had been involved in the slave trade. What does the Constitution say about slavery? Just hinted at here in the Declaration, in this mention of domestic insurrections. By the way, there were some who were freed, there were some who fought for the British and didn't get their freedom, and the British didn't redeem, but for the most part, this was not widespread at the Revolution, although historians are uncovering this history a little more precisely. What does the Constitution say about slavery? Do you know? The Declaration doesn't say anything about it explicitly, except at this little hint, because they ruled out the clause Jefferson drafted about it. What is well, the Constitution never uses the word slavery, but it does allude to slavery 3 times, at least. The first is when representatives are apportioned. They'll be apportioned according to the population of the states, and 3/5 of all other persons, the population of free inhabitants, and 3/5 of all other persons being presumed to mean those who were enslaved. Second time, Congress is forbidden from abolishing the slave trade before 1808, but by implication, quite clear implication, allowed to abolish the slave trade in 1808. Do you know when the slave trade is abolished? The international slave trade is abolished in the United States. You want to guess? 1808. In other words, it was abolished the very first day it could be, January 1, 1808, according to a bill that was passed by Congress in February of 1807. That bill was signed, not vetoed, by the president at the time, who was president in 1807. Do you know that? Somebody must have done president in academic games or quiz bowl or something, huh? Oh, Lincoln is not even born, right? He's born in 09, I think, right? Who was president? Yes. Close. But Washington died in 1799, and we ruled out, couldn't have been Lincoln. So somewhere between Washington and Lincoln, okay? Yes? Thomas Jefferson. Okay, you got it back there too? Good. Very good. Thomas Jefferson. So of all things, Thomas Jefferson, notorious as a slave owner himself, everyone knew that, but he is the one who had penned the argument, accusing the king of being responsible for slavery. And he actually signs that bill that abolishes not slavery, but the international slave trade in 1808. That's the second time. The third time, it's probably the most notorious time, that's in Article 6, right? Which is the Fugitive Slave Clause. No, I've got that wrong. It's Article 4, right? Article 4. And that would be on page 44. No person held to service or labor in one state escaping into another. See, they don't say slave, but that's sort of the implication of what it is. Now, I say the Declaration or the Constitution fulfills the promise of the Declaration. And the original Constitution of 1787 does that, I think, by all of those passages I read and many others you can look up, all the technical parts. But the promise of the first paragraph of the Declaration, the promise that all men are created equal, and that government exists not to suppress their rights, but to secure their rights, that's fulfilled only later by the Constitution. Turn, if you would, to page 53. Here you'll find the first and only mention of the slavery in the Constitution. It's in the 13th Amendment. That's ratified in 1865. Do you know what president proposed the 13th Amendment and worked very hard to see that it was passed through Congress? Abraham Lincoln. Okay, good. You ever seen the movie by Steven Spielberg called Lincoln? That's what it's about. It's not about Lincoln's whole life. It's about precisely the effort to pass the 13th Amendment through Congress and then get it ratified by the states after he was assassinated. Neither slavery nor involuntary servitude, except as punishment for a crime, shall exist in the United States or any place subject to their jurisdiction. The 14th Amendment, securing us all as citizens and granting us privileges and immunities that the states can't take away. The original Constitution made it clear that the United States government can't take away our privileges and immunities. But remember, the states had their own constitutions, and the federal Constitution doesn't replace the state constitutions. It only is supreme over them if there's a conflict between them. And they wrote it so ordinarily there wouldn't be a conflict. But now, the federal government in the 14th Amendment is going to take responsibility for protection of rights, even if a state government is going to violate them or wants to violate them. And then the 15th Amendment, of course, extending the vote to people without regard to their race. So the full answer to that question of whether the Constitution fulfills the promise of the Declaration, I think it's aiming to from the beginning. And you see that in the actions they take in constructing institutions that will be free from the defects of the British government. But the fulfillment of the larger principles in the Declaration and the larger principles of the Revolution, the principles that are announced in that, in those first two paragraphs, especially the beginning of the second paragraph, that's fulfilled only by the amendments that come after the Civil War.